Hello and welcome to this development and support webinar delivered by the NIHR Academy. My name is Krishna Day and I'm delighted to actually introduce you to today's session, which is Coaching for Success. During the event, we'll be exploring how you as a leader can use coaching skills to engage and inspire the teams that you're working with. And you'll also discover some practical tools and tips to help you in terms of the coaching conversations that you plan to have. The webinar is delivered in collaboration with Cappfinity, and they are one of the leadership development training providers who work with us and deliver the current Future Focused Leadership Development Program. Our facilitator is Stephanie Hopper, and she's the Director of Development Solutions at Cappfinity. But before I hand you over to Stephanie, I've got a few housekeeping tips. Firstly, we really value your engagement because the number of people who are participating in terms of this, we actually look to do that through our polls. So we'll have some polls that you can answer, but you can also ask questions. And if you go to the Q&A area, you can post your question there, and you can also vote up questions that other people leave. And that will help us in terms of prioritizing the questions that we will address at the end of the formal presentation. Secondly, I know that very often when people attend webinars, just like myself, I like to have the copy of the slides, and those will be available to you. So you'll have the opportunity to actually complete a feedback form. We also value your feedback about the event and what we can do differently, and also in terms of other events in the future that you'd like to see us host. But in that, you can leave your details and we will then email you a copy of the slides. Thirdly, if you're attending the event live and actually one of the things you want to do is actually have the opportunity to watch it again, we will have a replay of this event available on our YouTube channel, and more of that a little bit later on. But also you can forward it on to other colleagues who actually might find it of value. And finally, make sure you've got a pen and paper or your digital notepad, or if you're like me, your mobile phone, to be able to actually capture the notes and the ideas and tips that actually Stephanie is going to be sharing with us today. I do hope you find value in this event, and I will now pass it over to Steph.
Thanks, Krishna. So today, as Krishna has said, we're going to talk about coaching success, the ways in which we can adopt a coaching mindset in our daily interactions at work. I'd like to start by asking ourselves this question: how do we become great at something? Surgeon, professor, and best-selling author Atul Gawande starts with this question in his TED Talk, and he believes there are two schools of thought. First is the traditional pedagogical view. You go to school, you study, you practice, you learn, you graduate, and then you go out into the world and make your way on your own. We have a perception that a professional is someone who's capable of managing their own improvement. This is the approach which virtually all professionals have learned by. It's how doctors, lawyers, scientists, even musicians. And he uses the example of the Juilliard Music School violin instructor, Dorothy DeLay, who's worked with many virtuosos and claimed her aim was for her students to be able to make their way in the world without her. The second is a contrasting belief, mostly held in the world of sports, and the belief is you're never done. Everybody needs a coach. A much quoted example is how in 1875, Harvard and Yale played the first of the American rules football games. Yale hired a head coach. Harvard didn't. Over the next 3 decades, they continued to play. Yale with their coach and Harvard with no coach. In those 30 games, Harvard won just 4 times. So of course, in 1905, the inevitable happened 30 years later, and Harvard hired a coach and evened the playing field. But why does this matter? As professionals, we approach development and growth with the first mindset. We take responsibility for our learning and improvement, and Gawande was exactly like this. His talk describes how, as a surgeon, he became fascinated with the second approach, but the idea of getting someone to come into theatre with him and critique his performance seemed utterly absurd. Surely the idea of being a head surgeon meant not needing to be coached. but he went ahead and he set it up. The first time he was observed, from his perspective, his list went smoothly, even beautifully. He was really pleased with the outcome of his procedures. So he was really shocked when he met his coach and found they had 4 pages of reflections and questions to ask him and to share. After 2 months of this process, he began to feel a change in his performance, and after a year, his surgical complication rate had dropped even further. Overall, he described the process as painful. He didn't always want to work on things, but he felt the process was profoundly important. What Gawande learned was that coaching wasn't something that had to be seen as remedial. It could move him from good to excellent, rather than perhaps poor to average. So today's session is about that. It's about coaching and coaching for success. Gawande's experience hopefully widens our implicit understanding of what coaching is as a starting point for this session. Perhaps the binary way he describes it is as a choice between that traditional pedagogical view and the sports mindset of constant improvement is a bit too simplistic, but it demonstrates that having a mindset that is open to constant learning and input is critical to embracing coaching, both as coachees and as managers and leaders who use coaching in their teams. So before we move on, just a little bit in terms of the context in which we're working in. And these numbers come from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development Survey, CIPD. 97% is the number of people who agree with the statement, coaching skills are a necessary part of a manager's skill set. 95% is the number of organisations who expect managers to coach, or put it another way, 5% of organisations don't expect their managers to coach. And 20% is the number that represents managers who've been trained to deliver coaching. So what's this data telling us? Basically, coaching is universally seen as a positive intervention and as something that's necessary and that we expect from our leaders. Yet it's something most of us feel we lack the skills to do. And it's at this point that really, when I'm trying to sort of sell the benefits, if you like, of coaching to leaders, I find that they have some thoughts going around in their mind. And these thoughts usually sound like this: that's all great, but a good time to introduce a favourite quote of mine. If you want to reach your goals, you must shrink the size of your butt. The reality of this quote, both for a coach and coachee, changes how we approach coaching. These days, you would be hard pressed to find a leader who does not know that a large part of their job is to coach their employees. Nor is it hard to find evidence that the companies with the strongest leadership cultures are those that develop people at every level. And yet you don't have to look too far to find managers who ignore or avoid this vital part of their job description. So why is that? The culture in which they work may not insist on it, and many managers may also find it uncomfortable. For some people, the idea of regularly talking one-to-one to an employee and sort of finding out how they're doing makes them feel uneasy. And so what happens is we develop rationales for not coaching. So my question to you is, what is your biggest blocker when it comes to avoiding using coaching? And I'm going to open a poll for you and ask you to vote. I'll give you a number of choices, things like not finding the time or not knowing how to do it. So the poll has been launched now. I'd love you to vote in the next 30 seconds. So you've got about 25 seconds left. So is it that you can't find the time for it? Is it that you don't know how to do it? Is it just avoiding that kind of personal conversation? Or is it just that, you know, the returns are a long time coming? You've got about 8 seconds left now. 8 seconds left. Great, that looks like a lot of you have voted now, so I'm going to end the poll. Brilliant. And just to share the results with you immediately, it looks like a lot of us feel like we either don't have the time to do it or we perhaps don't know how to do it. So let's move on and talk a little bit about those blockers. We find a common issue is the finding time challenge. And we see a lot of people who say that is the main reason that they won't use coaching. It does feel more time consuming. And actually, evidence shows that it's one of those activities which does have a really profound payoff. Productivity and employee satisfaction are often cited as being most improved by the coaching. And that was a researcher called Anderson in 2001. The personal, I know a few of you said the kind of the idea of the personal, more emotional conversation can be a blocker. Remember, when done correctly, coaching is a conversation about an employee and the workplace. It's not about their personal life. The focus should be on what's happening at work. And then for those of you who felt maybe you weren't too sure how to do it, or it wasn't your style or strength, that's what I hope to address during the rest of this session. So before we get to the how, it's really important to recognise that coaching is not something that happens in a vacuum. Coaching for success needs a suitable context. In other words, we need to be thinking about the culture of our team as much as our technique. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Take this statement. It's a phrase originated by Peter Drucker, a management guru, and made famous by Mark Fields, who was the president at Ford in the early 2000s. It doesn't mean strategy is unimportant, rather that a powerful and empowering culture was a surer route to success. The way we connect and interact with our people day in and day out is what makes the culture. For those of you who attended the previous webinar we ran on leadership in uncertainty, we referenced how in terms of crisis, as leaders, we tend to default to that directive, more controlling approach that you see on the left-hand side of the slide, away from a collaborative, more consultative approach on the right-hand side of the slide. It is a continuum of different types of skills, and when we're coaching, we're much more likely to be on the right-hand side of this spectrum. When we're coaching, we're listening, we're asking great questions, we're reflecting back, we're paraphrasing, as opposed to telling people what to do. Our chances of success are higher when we have a team engaged and motivated. In examining research on coaching effectiveness, researchers Demuse and Dye reported that in one study, 96% of organisations saw individual performance improve after they introduced coaching. So far, I guess I've made coaching sound a little bit like a magic wand which fixes everything. But I'm wondering, for those of you who use coaching at the moment, when do you regularly use it with your team, and when do you think it's most effective? So again, I'm going to open another poll here. And for those of you who don't use it much at the moment, you may feel that you don't want to answer, which is fine. Although I have given you an option where you can say, I've never coached anyone. So I'm going to ask you to tell me how you mostly use coaching with your team. I've opened the poll now. Is it for solving problems? Is it developing and supporting kind of long-term goals? Is it around improving performance? Or is it none of those things above? Or is it actually in all of those situations? Or is it that you've never coached anyone? I'll give you about another 15 seconds to respond, so just a little bit more time than last time. So you've got 10 seconds left now. And we'll see the reasons why we currently at the moment use coaching. 5 seconds left for any final votes. Brilliant. Okay. So let me share the results with you. So it looks like a relatively even spread actually across the first three. So solving problems, developing and supporting achievement of long-term goals, and improving performance. A small number of you, a couple of you don't use it for any of those. And the majority of you use it actually for all of those above reasons. And then there's a bunch of you who haven't yet coached anyone, which is really exciting, because I hope after today, you'll walk away and have some ideas about how to bring a coaching mindset into your conversations that you're having every day. Okay, there are lots of models of how to coach. So some of you, if you've had some basic coaching training, may have experienced something like the GROW model. It's really common in organisations to train managers on the GROW model, which was developed by a guy called John Whitmore. But rather than focus today on a framework, Today's objective is more about how can I adopt a coaching mindset, and enables you to walk away with a set of simple tools to adopt in your daily interactions with your team. And then whatever development you do after this around your coaching skills and whatever framework you go on to use, you'll be able to find your own authentic way. Coaching is not about pushing solutions onto them. It's a way of pulling solutions out of them. Just let you reflect on that. This epitomizes what we need to know about coaching. Both sides of the relationship are dynamic. Neither is passive. And as a coach, we believe that the other person holds all the answers they need. Our role is to help them find those answers. So what does pull rather than push look like? A simple example might be your team member comes to you and they say, I don't feel confident about this presentation. I really feel I don't know the audience or what success would look like. If you were using push, you would probably say, well, what you need to do is look up all the attendees, work out what's going to be important to them, think about the structure of your presentation, do some practice with me, talk to others in the team, and clarify with the person who's asked you to do this what success would look like. But if you were using pull, you might just say, what can you do to help yourself feel more confident? The belief being that they know what they need to do and you're there to help to facilitate that. So the dynamic nature of pull and push results in stretch and support. Support being using empathy and compassion to signal you when you're in that coaching mindset that you're willing to help them work out how they can do it better for themselves. For instance, in the previous example, we may have said, I know how you feel about this presentation. I can feel very similar to that when I'm overwhelmed by an audience I don't know. I'm sure you're going to be okay though. Stretch is challenging your coachee. Now that's not with your expertise, but with a new perspective. I like to think of it as, you know, it's been a while probably since any of us have been in a shop with a changing room. But you know how in a changing room you get those mirrors that are tilted? I always think it's like tilting the mirror. So it's holding a new lens to a problem to see more options. And again, going back to that previous example, what we may say is, how could you look at this situation differently? We'll return to these definitions, but for now, the focus is on the movement between stretch and support. Each coaching conversation is a dance, and I use the word dance intentionally, a dance between support and stretch, a purposefully choreographed movement between two active parties. Both parties have a role in the conversation. It's not a clash, which would imply kind of something accidental or people with different goals or agendas, nor is it a slow walk, which would imply passive movement of some sort, or perhaps you're both walking in the same direction, but there's some tension about pace or direction. Having worked as an executive coach for a number of years, I know that instinctively I can find myself offering support very easily, as I naturally will adopt that approach. I remember working with a coachee who was a chief technology officer. Despite a huge amount of success, he just kept doubting himself and felt that he was somehow going to be found out. He had that kind of imposter syndrome, which some of you may have heard about. And there was no evidence to prove this at all. And I think in some ways, I empathise with him, probably because it's something I have related to in the past. And so I was hugely supportive towards him as his coach. What I noticed, though, was that things began to change a little more for him when I was able to ask more courageous questions that perhaps stretched his thinking and helped him to see that that belief was perhaps holding him back and potentially could end up hindering his performance. And sure enough, as I moved more into stretch, things began to change. So why does it matter having that balance between, I guess, support and stretch? Well, if there's too much stretch and too much challenge, what you see in the other person is low commitment. The other person almost could feel bulldozed into doing something or not feeling bought in. And actually sometimes what you can end up with is a very sort of intellectual conversation, but actually no commitment to taking any action. Too much support can lead to low action and change. The manager can be just seen as almost a cheerleader, and there's no real outcomes to the conversation, and the individual feels supported but isn't really going to move forward. I've got a scenario for you now to get us started with support. So you've just been on a video conference, something I think a lot of us have been doing recently, with a member of your team and some of their senior colleagues. In the meeting, the member of your team made a mistake and they were challenged by the others on the call. Your team member didn't react very well and was clearly distressed. You follow this conference call with a one-to-one coaching session. When your team member expresses their concerns and they're worried that they've damaged their reputation with their senior colleagues, you wish to demonstrate support to them. So I'm just wondering, what do you think support might look like in this situation? So I'm going to share with you another poll, and I'm going to give you different statements that potentially support could look like. So I'll launch the poll and then I'll read the options out to you. So of course it's not your fault. Anyone could have made that mistake. Don't worry, I'll fix the situation with the others. I will speak to them. To be honest, the others made mistakes all the time and were a bit unfair to you. Tell me more about your concerns. How can we get this back on track? So I'll have a drop of water while you vote. I'll give you 15 seconds. Great, another 10 seconds. There are some clear winners here, folks. Great, let's end the poll there. Okay, I'll share the results in a second with you. So, in fact, the overall challenge, I think, as human beings, when we're in the support mode, is that we are actually wired to help. Automatically, what we want to do is jump in and tell someone else what to do to fix the problem or improve their performance. I totally know I've got this instinct, and where I've really observed it though is sometimes when we're working with leaders and managers, and we do something called action learning, which is where they coach in a group and they learn to coach each other. And we set up the whole experience so that they understand what the core skills are in coaching. And we provide a sort of framework to the session. And then we kind of start the process off. So with the core skills, we tell them it's about listening, it's about asking great questions, you know, perhaps reflecting a little, but it's very much about the coachee, and we try to really embed that idea. And it's so funny because as soon as we start the process, bang, straight away, someone is desperate to dive in and tell someone else what to do. And it just seems to be utterly instinctive to most of us. And curiously, neuroscience tells us that isn't the best way. And it will often generate the exact opposite outcome to what we're striving for. Research by Richard Boyatzis and his colleagues at Case Western Reserve show the person is likely to feel obligated or pressured then. And it activates a psychophysiological state known as the negative emotional attractor, or the NEA. What we really call coaching for compliance. A person feels that the emphasis is to get them to comply with us, and the result is that person feels defensive and begins to shut down. So if we know that can be one of the traps, what does support really look like? And support really is listening with intent, not listening to crash. And there are some common blockers that all of us fall into where we're kind of wired to help, which are summarized by that lovely acronym, CRASH. I think one of the challenges is that this is further reinforced in social situations. We're kind of hardwired to help each other. We listen to our friends and family, you know, at the weekends, in the evenings, and as soon as they present a problem to us, most of us do one of two things. We identify that problem with a situation we've been in that's similar and share that back, or we typically try and help them fix their problem. So professionally, it's just being able to switch off that instinct as it gets in the way of us listening with intent and fascination, which when we've got a coaching mindset, we really bring to the conversation. And it's staying with our coachee's story and helping them to find their own answers. If we're listening to crash, we know that we're not turning off our own inner dialogue in service of our coaching. So in terms of the different examples we've got there, the first one, compete. It's not your fault. Anyone could have made that mistake. Let me share the results with you. A few of you thought that might be a good response. And it's not a bad response as such, but it's more sympathy than support. So if we want to support, we probably want to think more about a different response. I think only a couple of you voted for, to be honest, the others make mistakes all the time or are a bit unfair to you, which is a bit of a kind of rescuer response. Again, most of us want to do that to make life easier, to sort of save them. The problem is it denies the person the chance to find their own solution, and it creates a pattern that will play out almost again and again. Avoiding, I didn't really give you an option there, but so often that can happen where there's a kind of elephant in the room and we kind of avoid talking about it. Around solving, don't worry, I will fix this situation with others. I will have a word with them. Just one of you thought that might be useful. And again, it's another way of rescuing, I guess, and probably best to be avoided if we want them to be able to support themselves. And then haste, ignoring the sort of emotion and listening to kind of compute. So avoiding the emotional part and denying them the chance to solve can also be a trap. But I'm pleased to say the majority of you said, tell me more about your concerns, which would be the best demonstration of support. How we can get this back on track, I have to say probably is, I quite like it as an answer and a response, and is a good one. It's a kind of solutions focused approach. I suppose tell me more about your concerns will allow the person to go a little bit deeper, and maybe at the next stage it's how can we get this back on track. But this is really being quite analytical with something that's quite instinctive when we're in the conversation. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Let's look at what else constitutes support in coaching. Now we've thought about listening with intent. So the second thing we've got is observing and noticing. With observing and noticing, listening isn't just something we do with our ears. To really support someone, we have to know what is going on with them. That means not noticing them, it means noticing them completely, not just the words they're using. It's the whole person. It's using all of your senses. Can you hear the tone of voice they're using? How fast or slow are they speaking? What facial expressions are they giving away? What's their eye contact or body language like? I remember feeling really frustrated early on in my relationship with my husband when he kind of worked me out and picked up that often I'd agree to something, but my leg would tap. And he realized that meant that I didn't really agree. I was obviously trying to be a bit compliant early on in the relationship, but that's long gone, I can tell you. But it's being able to be aware of that whole person. And of course, we've got the challenge now that we're doing this virtually. But to be honest with you, if I let you into a secret, as a coach, I really quite enjoy coaching sessions on the phone. I feel fully focused on that person's voice, and it's amazing the amount you can hear. When someone's smiling on the phone, you can tell. Now, that's not to say I don't like video communication, because it's incredible now that the world we're in, but there's a lot more data for us to be watching. And I'm not suggesting that you analyse every movement in every conversation, just an awareness that there's a lot of data being presented to you outside of what the words are. Look at the picture on the slide. I'm really excited with where my role is heading. You know, do you think that statement matches the body language of the person speaking? To be honest, it's really hard to judge, isn't it? And, you know, looking at the picture, we don't really know them in real life and we're not sure. Maybe that is their excited and happy face. The point is, we might raise the question, I know you said you're really happy. I'm noticing your body language perhaps is suggesting otherwise. What all of this does is show we're really listening and we're present in the moment. Next, I want to explore one final part of support, and it's one of the trickiest parts of listening with intent in coaching, especially for those we manage. On the slide is a statement, and I'm going to read it out 3 times. I am going to attempt to emphasize a different word. This is when I wish I'd been to theatre school. Listen and think about the meaning of each. I know you didn't steal the biscuits. I know you didn't steal the biscuits. I know you didn't steal the biscuits. Hopefully you all picked up on how the emphasis changed the meaning. Whether it was me implying that, someone else stole the biscuits, or that you stole something completely different. And I've used that example because it can be really tricky when you're coaching. It's easy to become over-focused on the content, often very detailed content from our coachee. And when you open up a conversation, in my experience, people can often talk quite a lot. Once they feel sort of secure and comfortable, they will actually share quite a lot of information. And I always find it quite tempting to try and understand all that information and take it all in. But if we get too lost in that detail and in trying to understand, or make a sort of subjective interpretation of what they're describing, we aren't always helping our coachee. If we can help them to think more deeply about what they mean, then we can be more effective in helping them to move forward. So let me show you what I mean. So the final thing we're covering here is support is clarifying meaning. One of the ways we can do this is through reflecting. That basically means repeating back what somebody has said and therefore prompting them, perhaps adding a question on as we repeat back. It implies we're really listening, and it gives people a chance to reflect and reevaluate what they've said. I'm always amazed how by simply reflecting back what I've heard leads to much more content being revealed, and how it seems to help someone to process their thoughts. Hearing back what they've just said somehow unleashes more content. So understanding content is not the goal of the coach. Understanding the meaning of that content for the individual is. So an example is, I might say to someone, you said, I find this work environment really challenging. What aspects of it do you find challenging? Or I might say, you mentioned you feel like you've completely messed up your career. That's a strong phrase to use. Or finally, a minute ago, you mentioned you're struggling at the moment. Can you tell me what has changed for you? So I'm reflecting back, and then I'm adding in a prompt or a thought. And that's often what's going to unleash more content. So in summary, support is using empathy and compassion to signal you as their coach that you're willing to help them work out how they can do it better for themselves, whether that's listening with intent, observing and noticing, or clarifying meaning. When I'm coaching clients, I'm very focused on them. I switch off all technology and I give them my 100% attention. In fact, yesterday I was coaching an NIHR leader and I'd done that, and then I realized I still have my smartwatch on and it was buzzing, and I just took it off and pushed it to one side on my desk. But I'm going to be honest with you and give you a confession that I'm not particularly proud of. I'm very aware that when I'm working as a professional coach, that's what I do. But at Cappfinity, often when I'm working with team members, I'm not always so disciplined, as we work in an environment that kind of leverages technology and is quite fast paced. So I sort of give myself permission to be distracted. But actually, that's something that I really need to change. So I'm wondering what you can do to pay full attention and listen with intent. Even if it's only a 15-minute window, how can you ensure you're able to observe the whole person? Let's now move to the other side of the dance, which is stretch. Earlier, we defined stretch as challenging your coachee, not with your expertise, but with a new perspective. Stretch is, as I said, tilting the mirror, holding a new lens to a problem to see more options. One way to challenge is to ask questions. And on the slide, we've got a statement. Today has been challenging. If we think supporting is the right stance here, we would maybe ask the coachee to clarify that statement. If we're stretching though, then we would be sort of trying to help them see a new perspective or see the problem through a new lens. However, there is one question we have had on autopilot since we were young. And I'm wondering if you can guess what it is. Today has been challenging. Why? The trouble with why is it triggers a sort of automatic response from the other person, and that auto reaction is usually defensive. For example, listen to these why questions. Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you want to sign up for this? Why were you late for work today? Why are you looking at me like that? Why can't you do this? Just this once. Why are you always, why do you never? Notice what they all have in common. In each, we're being required to account for our actions. The questioner is demanding we justify our thoughts or feelings or actions, and we're sort of being put on the spot. It creates a bit of a parent-child dialogue, and most of us respond automatically without thinking about it. So the questioner puts themselves in a more superior position through that why question. Why questions often seem to lead one way or another to feelings of sort of self-criticism or limiting thoughts. Why can't we get this right? Why haven't we done it that way all along? And they can lead to us being really defensive. A why question, I suppose, can limit our thinking and keep us trapped in the problem. So what might be some useful alternatives? If we use deeper and more useful questions, we're more likely to get more insightful answers. So if I said to you, why are you reading that book? You might tell me a story about some things that you're wondering about. Maybe you'd go on to provide a few details of what brought you to this moment of information seeking. Your responses would probably have something to do with the past. But if you were instead asked, what outcome do you want to reach by reading this book? Your answers would become more future-oriented and make you think more deeply about your actions. On the slide are a set of why-led responses. See what happens if we change them to a different type of question. What questions tend to keep us open to discovering new information about ourselves, even if the information is negative and goes against our beliefs. What questions can draw us towards our potential, keep us curious and help us create a better future? Interestingly, when it comes to the questions we ask ourselves, self-reflection or introspection, they're full of why questions. Why didn't I get that promotion? Why do I feel this way? But these why questions inhibit our ability to know and understand ourselves better. A study by Hickson and Swan found undergraduates who were asked to think about why questions in an internal evaluation had a much harder time accepting the data and final report than the ones who had asked what questions. And there are many others which show us that when using the word why in self-reflection, it leads to lower levels of self-awareness. Overall, as a coach, what we want to be doing is using great open questions as they elicit so much more information and get the other person to think, but always avoiding the why. So look at this picture on the slide. Think about, what does an empty plate represent to you? A satisfied diner, a hungry diner, a selfish diner, there's only one set of only one knife and fork there, maybe a greedy diner, or maybe something else. Why have we asked you this question? The principle, I guess, is linked to the idea that as a coach, we're not neutral. We've got values, assumptions, experiences, beliefs that we're bringing to the table, which influence our thoughts and actions as a coach. In regards to the empty plate, we have these examples from an article in the Huffington Post. So apparently in India, you should finish everything that's on your plate because it's considered a respect for the served food. The same is true about finishing your plate in Japan. The Japanese consider it rude to leave food on your plate, whether you're at home or in a restaurant. In China, however, leaving behind an empty plate is a sign to the host that you're still hungry. If you don't want to eat more food, consider leaving a little behind to let the host know you've had enough. Ethiopians don't bother with plates. Individual plates are actually considered wasteful, and they share meals off one big communal plate and generally eat with their hands using a type of flatbread to pick up food. Imagine yourself as a tourist in the culture of the person you're coaching. What assumptions and values might we bring to the conversation? One of the biggest traps that managers fall into here when they're coaching is they assume that coachees are on the same trajectory as themselves. Success is promotion to our level. If we aren't aware, having that belief could limit the amount of challenge the person we coach, with the amount of challenge we bring to the person we coach. That's why challenge is so important. We are checking in and not making assumptions that might lead the conversation. So to summarize, stretch is challenging your coachee, not with your expertise, but with a new perspective. It's holding a new lens to a problem to see more options. It means repositioning with the right questions. What, who, how, not why. Stepping away from your assumptions, your values, your experiences, and think about what we're bringing to the table and how they might get in the way. And finally, all coaching conversations should lead to action, even if sometimes that action is just focused reflection. Each conversation should finish with a commitment to action. If this is missing, chances are this was not coaching, just an interesting conversation. Always challenge the person being coached to commit to a specific action that will advance his or her cause in a significant way. I'd love to leave you with a final thought to reflect on about yourself as a leader and a manager. As managers and leaders, we're having a whole variety of conversations every day with our followers or direct reports, and we're often coaching them as they're making their way through a kind of maze or labyrinth. The default for us, especially if we've been in the same maze or labyrinth, is to act like a sat-nav. Tell them exactly what to do, where they need to find an exit, precisely solve their challenge. But to be a true coach, we really need to act like a torch, shining a light on some of the obstacles in their path, helping them find their own route out of the maze, a route of their own creation that they're committed to and have designed themselves. Thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Really, really good tips there. And one of the things that I've noticed is there's quite a lot of questions. So if you're okay, we're going to have a look at those. If you haven't had the opportunity to ask a question, go to the Q&A area. You'll see questions that have been asked already, and you actually can also vote them up. So I'm going to start with a question that has been asked, which actually isn't necessarily the one at the top, but I think be a great place for us to explore first, because I think people often get this mixed up in terms of what do you see as being the key difference between coaching and mentoring?
Oh yeah, sure. It's a good question, because I think we incorrectly interchange those two words, and for me they're quite different. So for me, the difference between mentoring and coaching, I guess it's interesting to know that mentor comes from Greek mythology. So I believe that I think it was Odysseus was going away somewhere and left his son with his friend mentor and said, tell him everything you know about life. And for me, mentoring is passing on experience and knowledge. So usually mentoring works really well if you go to someone either one-off or, you know, for a collection of conversations, and they maybe have walked in your shoes in a similar situation and can share their experiences with you. Coaching for me is quite different, because actually in some ways having expertise in something is a big blocker to being a good coach, because what we want to do is share our expertise, and actually as a coach your job is to facilitate and help that person find their own answers. So I hope that helps.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I do know that there's lots of people get those mixed up, or as you say, some organizations use them interchangeably, so it's really helpful to have that clarification. I've got lots of great questions, and some of them are related to the situation we're in at the moment, where more and more of us are working remotely. So let's turn to that question next. So how could we actually manage our situation where we're actually looking to coach remotely and not face-to-face?
Sure, and I guess that partly depends what technology we've got available to us. But certainly I think you know, using regular, I mean, I think one thing I think about the virtual world, Krishna, is that we actually kind of need more structure rather than less. So we're not going to bump into the corridor or the coffee machine when we're working virtually. It just doesn't happen. So therefore, if there are people we need to interact with, we need to set up a time for us to interact with them. So that might be that sometimes we've done those one-to-ones informally just when we've seen someone, but actually if suddenly you're not in the same physical building every day, then there's a need to maybe have a regular catch-up in the diary. if you can use video, I think it can be incredibly helpful, because seeing the whites of someone's eyes, and thankfully today video works most of the time really well, famous last words. So if you've got access to Zoom or another, video conferencing app, I think that can make a really big difference. And just making sure that you're building in enough time for those connections, whether it be for a group or whether it be one-to-one.
Really good in terms of having some ideas there. As you say, you may want to have that video on. I know equally sometimes people don't want to have it on, and that doesn't help us in terms of actually seeing that body language, which sometimes can help. But the other thing I'd also say, Stefan, and I know that you do this as well, is that even just in a conversation, one of the things I was reflecting on in terms of what you shared today is the fact that by taking this approach, you can use the coaching approach in any conversation, exactly, whether you've scheduled it or not.
Exactly, because I think sometimes a blocker is thinking we've got to have this big formal 60-minute sit down, but actually, you know, it's just weaving some of those little things in, like really listening well to the other person, that can be, you know, a game changer in the way that we approach our conversations with our team members.
See a lot of questions flooding in here. I'm going to do my best to go through as many as possible. One that actually got a lot of upvotes, and I hope I do this justice in terms of paraphrasing it, but actually, what about in terms of coaching somebody who's resistant? So not everybody has somebody who's necessarily open, and that's had a lot of upvotes, I have to say. If I haven't paraphrased that correctly, please, whoever posted that originally, put a little bit more of a description into the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, I guess I'll have to make a few assumptions around the resistance, but I suppose, you know, my experience is that one of the things that can help unlock resistance, if you like, is me sharing a bit more of me with them. The more open I can be with that other person, I think the more likely I am to unblock that for them. So I'm trying to think of a good example, but it's almost like if someone is very resistant and it's a kind of, you know, say the scenario I used, you know, where they'd fallen out with someone in the team or whatever, and we've come out of that meeting together and I'm having a conversation, they don't really want to talk about it. I think what I would do is I would say, I can imagine this feels really difficult at the moment, and, you know, if you wish I could share an example of where that happened to me and how I felt. And I feel sometimes when we disclose a little bit, it can help the other person to feel more comfortable, to see us as kind of more human and not perfect. Because I think sometimes people almost put their managers a bit on a pedestal, you know, and we are just all human beings and we make mistakes and we've got strengths and weaknesses. So the more we can show the real person that we are, I think the easier it is for them to feel comfortable and secure to open up.
I want to ask another built on question from that. One of my experiences is sometimes that people who might be resistant that I've worked with, it actually takes some work to actually develop a trust. And I remember a conversation I had with somebody which actually was trying to actually understand their resistance. It wasn't necessarily something that had happened at that moment in time in the current organization, but actually I found out that it was down to other things. So if that resistance is naturally built into somebody, what are some of the ways that you could take a coaching approach to actually help unlock that and also build trust, which is a challenging thing to do if somebody is naturally blocking in terms of and not open to ideas? Yeah,
sure. I mean, I think investing time in that relationship is really important, and not kind of pushing them, because I think when they feel pushed, it's like when we use the challenge or the stretch part of coaching, you know, that will make it worse. I think demonstrating again where we've benefited from being supported in that way can be useful, and some of it's just about the kind of noticing. So you know, just saying, I'm sensing some resistance. You know, it's that elephant in the room. It's just saying in a gentle way. It's not labeling, or, you know, and it's just saying I'm sensing it or I'm feeling it, and seeing what that opens up. Because I find often when you play back those sort of senses and feelings that you've got, actually you unleash quite a lot of information. And it may take them some time to get to a place where they're comfortable, but working through that, I think, is really important.
Let's come back to the question of the current situation we're finding ourselves in, and it is a little bit different. And so the question we've got now to address is, how can we be effective in terms of coaching in the current situation where staff actually are having to work in different ways, and perhaps they actually have to have more direction, so they can't be allowed to have as much perhaps freedom to act as they might have had in the past, because of a specific workload.
Yeah, sure. And I think that continuum that I showed today and I showed in the previous webinar, from directive to, you know, kind of more purely consultative, is a spectrum that we should be moving up and down. I think the key is that most of us in our hearts know we quite like being in the tell you what to do stage, especially if we've been promoted based on our knowledge and experience. So when someone comes to us, it's very easy when you've got that domain knowledge to go, well, you need to do that. And it's sort of more of a temptation. And there's a guy who's written a book called Tim Galway. It's called The Inner Game of Work. You probably know it, Krishna. And I love his example where he talks about going in front of an orchestra and pulling the tuba player out, I think it is, from the back of the orchestra, and coaching this tuba player in front of the whole orchestra. And Tim Galway has never played the tuba. I don't know if he's played other musical instruments, but he's certainly not, you know, a virtuoso in the tuba. And he, you know, by asking questions, by getting the tuba player to break down what he's doing, he improves the guy's performance. And so I guess it's that thing of knowing the moments where actually I need to put some of my expertise to one side and I need to move away from directive and actually, you know, get the other person to think through what they're doing. And at the moment, it is difficult because I'm sure there's situations that you're facing where you've got to be more you know, directive about the instructions you're giving to people. And it's just about finding a balance and being aware of where that balance is, I guess.
Great. Now, I know there's a number of questions that have come up for those who've actually added things around understanding working with a resistant member of staff. I think we've actually covered those, so we'll kind of cover that off and close those down at the moment. But a number of questions have come up about resources, and you've just mentioned, for example, a book. Perhaps there's some other resources that you could direct people to. So let me see, particularly in terms of what's really resonated with people is the idea of the stretch and support conversations. If there's any recommended reading or tools around that, and also just other resources that could actually help people in terms of developing their skills as coaching. And I remember there was quite a lot of people who are attending today who actually don't have that experience.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, you're right, from the poll. So what we could do, if you wish, is on the last slide, when we send the slide deck afterwards, put some recommended reading. But I would recommend Carol Pemberton's book, which I don't have by my side, which I think is called Coaching for Performance or for Success, but I'll double check. And John Whitmore's book, which is called Coaching for Performance, so Carol Pemberton's isn't. Both of those have got some great suggestions in them. And probably just, you know, it's really going down to the basics and thinking to yourself, maybe at the end of the day, in those conversations I had, how much was I listening and how much was I talking? Just something as simple as that might be enough to start to change that balance for yourself and sort of almost score yourself and think about that. And what would I need to do to listen better tomorrow?
That's great. Thank you for all those questions you've got about resources that have come in. And also in that list, and that's very generous of you, Stephanie, to actually put together a slide there. I think people are also looking for maybe some open access resources as well that might be of assistance if people, you know, are not in a position to actually invest in books at this point in time. Let's come to the question about the best way of using coaching to actually help upskill somebody's team.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And because I suppose if I was in conversation with the person, I'd probably want to understand what is it we're upskilling the team in, because, you know, this doesn't get away from the fact that there are times where we need to learn something. You know, we need to actually get a book out and sort of, you know, learn a new process, a new procedure, a new way of doing something. If we're using coaching to upskill the team, perhaps more on the behavioural side, you know, how they're making decisions, how they're influencing others. You know, again, I think it's about not just presenting them with the answers or telling them how you would do it straight away. You know, it's natural and instinctive to get there in a conversation. If someone's struggling and they don't have any ideas, as a manager, it's almost ridiculous to not give them some suggestions. But what's nice is to start with, what do you think you could do? And how would you approach this? So just resisting back a little bit on, you know, just providing the answer straight off.
Great. Actually, to build on that is, what about a newly formed team? This particular question is to do with the research team, but actually it applies to any team. How could coaching be used to actually help them in terms of as they're just coming together?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this for me, I saw this question pop up actually before we started, and I was reflecting on it. And I suppose with newly formed teams where I have made suggestions, it's normally around some form of team development. So, and that can be led by the leader. It doesn't have to be led by anyone external or a facilitator necessarily. And it's getting them to have conversations, I think, around how do we want to work with each other? You know, what are all of our strengths? What do we bring to the table? What are the complementary partnerships that exist here? Where maybe as a team are we lacking, you know, to be aware of where we might kind of fall down? What are our values? What do we want to be known for? What's our kind of collective mission? And I think working through some of those things and having those conversations are what's going to start to form the identity of that team. And you could do that with an external consultant who kind of puts that all together for you, or you could lead it yourself as the leader of the team. And it's about creating a space for that conversation. I think, Krishna, it's always just so hard because most of us work in environments that are, you know, are busy and we've got lots of work tasks to do. So to create space for that team development is kind of sometimes hard, feels like a luxury, but actually we benefit in the long run if we can sort of carve out that space.
And it also made me reflect, Stephanie, in terms of whether or not this is a perfect time, because you've got a new team. So if they're all new into the organization or into the roles that they're in, that actually you could role model the fact that we can actually use coaching conversations, and it's not a one-way thing, is it? We can coach our peers. We can coach anybody around us. The principles that you've shared can be taken into the relationships we have inside and outside of work, even with our children. So I think it's a fantastic time if you're in that situation of establishing a new team to perhaps, you know, put it as part of this is the way of working we want to have. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of embed it in the culture of the team from the word go, which is really powerful and sort of empowering everyone to be part of that. I love that.
Got a couple of final questions here. I'm smiling at this one. Do people get annoyed when they realize they're being coached? Does that need a previous agreement from both parts?
Yeah, really good question. I'm not sure I've experienced people being annoyed. I think some people, look, I think there is, if you look up a model in psychology called transactional analysis, it talks about, you know, the difference between parent-child interactions and adult-adult interactions. And I think there's a little bit of all of us who kind of grow up, you know, I almost feel like in the workplace, our manager represents kind of our teacher or our parent in a way. And so we fall into the trap of wanting to be told, you know, like we want to make life easy for ourselves. And so we default to this sort of state of, you know, they know everything and I know nothing. Not exactly, but, you know, that sort of mindset of parent-child. And I think that can be tricky because actually what we need to have really healthy work relationships is adult-adult interactions. And so I think when people have an expectation that I'm going to be given all the answers and suddenly they realize they're not being given the answers, can be frustrating to them. And so I think the best thing you can do there is have a really open conversation about it. And, you know, and as a manager, the point is, this isn't about, you know, completely creating a one-to-one meeting that is just purely coaching. It's about weaving that mindset into the way you approach those conversations. So I don't want to keep repeating myself, but, you know, just listening a bit better, asking a few more questions. You may still give them some ideas or some solutions later down the line, but it's just changing the balance of how directive we are versus, you know, consultative.
And to complete on that question, and also our final question that we have, is that, you know, in terms of that coaching conversation, I guess it's partly built on what we said before about, does it need to be mutually agreed? Is it something you can do without explicitly saying, okay, Stephanie, I'm going to ask you some coaching questions here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in a one-to-one, it's, again, just thinking about your mindset as a manager or a leader as you go into that conversation. And also just, the other place where I think coaching can be really powerful is around careers, because it's the classic situation where you will have followed a certain trajectory, and we do make assumptions that people often want to follow a similar trajectory. It's an easy trap to fall into. But also, if there are alternative career paths, we may not know so much about them. And sometimes I think we're a bit scared to talk to someone about their options, or, you know, what they're doing with their career. And that's because we sort of feel like we need knowledge of those to even explore it. But actually, if you think about it, if you take the approach of asking some great questions, reflecting back what you're hearing, and just exploring, the other person gets a lot from that conversation without you telling them what to do. So I don't think explicitly you have to say, I'm going to coach you on this. I think this is very much about a mindset that you weave in some of these tools and techniques into your everyday conversations.
That's terrific. I think that's it for all of the questions.
Right.
So I just want to say thank you again, Stephanie, in terms of for all the guidance and all the tips and the practical advice that you've actually given to us today, in terms of actually trying to help us embed that coaching mindset that actually will help us in terms of as leaders and actually be able to practice. So there's some really practical advice. And I think, again, we've got some great response in terms of that idea about both supporting and also stretching. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, as you will have seen if you're here live in the chat area, we've already shared with you a link that if you are interested in actually giving us feedback, we'd really very much welcome it, because we always like to actually have some reflective practice in terms of explore what we did well and what needs to be further enhanced to support your learning, and also the other topics that you want to learn about in future parts of this development and kind of series of webinars and programs that we're running. But also, if you want to have access to the slides, if you'd find that helpful, then you can put your details of your email address there and we'll send that on, and including the fact that, thank you, Stephanie, again, for offering a page of some resources and tips there that people can actually refer to if they want to explore this a little bit further.
No problem.
Now, a replay of this event is going to be available over the next week. It will be on the NIHR YouTube channel. And it's in the development and support series of the whole series that we've been running. And you also see the other events that we actually held in this series over the last number of months. And also, if you want to share it with other people, then that's a great place for you to be able to do so. So you might want to share it with your team, if perhaps that idea where you're getting together as a new team and what is coaching, or perhaps share it with your peers and actually have a conversation in your leadership meetings about this being an approach, particularly in terms of, we know we got some questions about what's the difference between coaching and mentoring, and I think if we can have a level playing field in terms of having that understanding, and that will help us all if we're speaking with the same language. So you can also find that information there. And to learn about other events that we've got planned, then you'll find that on the NIHR website. If you go to the events tab, you can find it in the bottom navigation of the website. Just go straight to events and you can find any of our forthcoming events there, and you can subscribe to them. So thank you again for joining us today. We really hope that actually you found this session of value, and that you actually can take the ideas and the principles that we've shared here, and it can help you even from this afternoon's conversations in terms of supporting your team, your colleagues, and also yourself professionally. Thanks again for joining us.